All right, so the lesson that I am going to be showing you today is the My Seasonal Round, which is an ethnobotany and native peoples lesson. We are standing here at the main road into Willow-Witt along the campground footpath, and this is one of many places that you could begin this lesson. This lesson is going to start in one spot, travel along a trail, and then end at the wedding circle for the seasonal round portion of the lesson. So you could start it here, or you could start this lesson if you're transitioning from a different lesson back up at the kitchen area or the campground trail. Any of those places is going to be fine as long as you have a nice spot for students to gather before heading down a trail. Other setup to consider for this lesson is that when you start the lesson with students, you're going to want to have all of your ethnobotany cards ready to hand out after the engage as you head out on your hike. You're also going to want to make sure that before this lesson, you've set up at the camp or the wedding circle all of your seasonal round materials and tubs, and that you have your seasonal round poster there as well. Now, before starting this lesson or any of the lessons here at Willow-Witt, we encourage you to do a land acknowledgement. And that's for any sort of educational experience here at Willow-Witt, whether or not it's a tour, summer camp, or outdoor school. A land acknowledgement is always a great way to take a moment and notice where we are and acknowledge the people who have lived on and used this land for centuries. So to give an example of a land acknowledgement, I'm going to put this down so I can be fully present and just take a moment to experience this place and recognize that everything that happens on this land here at Willow-Witt happens on Indigenous land, and that the people who we're talking about, not only in this activity, but the people who have taken care of, lived on, and gotten resources from this land since time immemorial, were the Shasta, Takelma, and Cow Creek Umpqua tribes. And that all of these different tribes, their ranges overlapped, and that they still come here today as members of the Grand Ronde tribe, and that Willow-Witt has maintained relationships with the Grand Ronde tribe. Their students, archaeologists, and scientists come out to Willow-Witt to explore and take care of this land still, and that by acknowledging that this land is Indigenous land, we also take a moment to encourage you to find out what land you live on or work on and what Indigenous people have lived there, as well as how you can connect with those communities today and continue to educate yourself and build community with Indigenous people on that land. The first section of this lesson is the engage. So with all of the students gathered around, they can take a space for themselves where they aren't going to be distracted by others, or they can simply kneel or stand or wherever they're going to be comfortable. We're going to take a moment to do some imagination. And so we're going to have all of the students close their eyes and imagine that they are living hundreds of years ago. And then I'm going to ask them some questions. With your eyes closed, just in your mind's eye, look around. What season is it? What do you see around you? Are there people? Animals? What does the landscape look like? Are you warm or cold? What are you wearing? What do you smell? Is there a fire burning? Is there something cooking on the fire? If so, what is it? If there's nothing cooking on the fire, go to a place where you'll find food. What are you eating? How does it taste? You're now walking towards your home. What is it made of? And who are you with? You're going to give students plenty of time in between each question to imagine where they are. And don't hesitate to remind them that you don't have heated houses for shelter, vehicles to travel around in, or stores to buy food and clothing from. And in this imagination, we're going to have them then open their eyes and share what they imagined with another student in a think, pair, share. So they've had some time to think about it. Now they're going to pair up with another student and share what they were imagining. After a few minutes of sharing, you can have a few students share out to the whole group and explain that now we're going to be going on a hike to think about what are some of the ways that people hundreds of years ago found food and shelter in places just like this. In the explore part of this lesson, you're going to be taking students on an ethnobotany hike. So you're going to first explain that ethnobotany is the study of how plants and people interact. Now, we already know here at Willow-Witt that people use plants from the farm, but people can also and have also used plants from the forest for centuries. And so on this hike, you're going to be identifying plants that people have used and the ways in which we use them. Now, you might want to go ahead and flag some of these plants along the hike before you leave to help students to identify them, but you're going to hand out one of the ethnobotany ID cards to each student. And as you walk, have them in pairs or individually look for those plants, and whenever they spot it, you're going to stop the hike and let them share the information on their card and identify their plant. For example, one of the plants that you might see on this hike is oak. Now, oak is a really important plant to the people of this area, and for a variety of reasons, but the main one probably being, especially at this time of year where we're here now in fall, was the acorn harvest. And indigenous people from our area would harvest both California black oak and Oregon white oak acorns, process them, cook them, and save that food for eating throughout the entire winter. And so you can have students, when they get here, identify the oak tree, talk about and read from their card the uses of acorns and any others for oak that they might think of, and also then look for acorns if it's the right season, which is usually late summer and fall. Other plants that you're going to see along the trail might be wild strawberry, yarrow, ponderosa pine, where they would collect pine seeds and pine nuts, and many, many others that you're going to identify before you come up here using those cards, just to make sure you're in an area where they're going to be able to see some of those plants, and also that you're in a season where those plants will be readily visible. At the end of your hike, you want to end up here in the wedding circle that overlooks the wetlands. You get here by coming past the kitchen and turning right following the blue arrows. Once you're here, I would encourage you, if the ground isn't too wet, to have students kneel or sit, just to kind of give them a rest, as well as to refocus their attention as you start the explain portion. This is going to be a time when you're going to be talking for a little bit, sharing some information, so to have those students settled and in place is always really helpful. So as we've arrived here, we've noticed that the landscape has changed. We're no longer on a forested trail, and now we're overlooking some of the historic wetlands here at Willow-Witt. Now, we've been talking about ethnobotany and the ways that people and plants have interacted, And this is a really unique location because these wetland fields are also where camas has been propagated and harvested for centuries. Now, in early summer, usually between May and July, these fields will have thousands of purple flowers highlighting the camas plant's bloom. At this time, you would want to show students the pictures of the camas fields throughout different seasons. So depending on what season you are here, you may or may not make it for the flowering, but we've got pictures of flowering camas, and then also share some of the ethnobotany of camas because it is such a vital and important plant to Indigenous people of this area. And it's also just so unique and cool that there is this amazing resource right here at Willow-Witt. So you want to share about when camas flowers, how it's harvested and dug, and that then it is baked in camas ovens. And also, always when we're talking about camas, you want to talk about how it's really difficult to identify an edible camas versus the death camas, which is highly toxic, so that students know they should never go out and try and harvest camas on their own. They need to be with a really knowledgeable ethnobotanist who can identify that with them if they're going to look for camas. So also during this explain portion, we're going to be referring back to those imagination thoughts that we had at the beginning of the lesson, thinking about what was life in this area like more than 300 years ago. Reminding students that before contact with Western settlers, there were Takelma, Shasta, and Cow Creek Umpqua people living in this area since time immemorial, and that they had a distinct relationship with this very land here, coming here to harvest camas and to collect pine nuts and many, many other resources from this land. You're going to use the photo story cards to share some of the history, the shared history of these tribes and Western settlers. So you're going to be sharing information about pre-contact life and history, as well as how the Shasta and Takelma people were killed and forcibly removed from this land in the 1850s and are now members of the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes and still maintain relationships with this land, live all over Oregon and the world today. During the elaborate portion of this lesson, we are going to be exploring a seasonal round. Now, we've been talking a lot about how plants and people interact, and seasonality has a lot to do with that. So when we think about how people interact with their space, the seasons can be shown in a diagram such as this. Now, this is just a diagram of a seasonal round. The seasonal round is really more about the experience of harvesting, hunting, traveling, and experiencing the seasons as in the past as well as today. So you're going to share a diagram of the seasonal round with students and kind of explain to them that it's kind of like a calendar, right? We see the different months of the year around the outside, along with different plants that might be blooming or harvested during those seasons, and animals that could be active or hunted, and then different tools and activities as well. You're going to encourage students to think about their own lives and the way that they interact with seasons and some of the different ways that you might experience seasons, whether or not it's through weather, traditions, foods, or activities. You're also going to have set up in this circular area kind of a kinesthetic, a movable seasonal round. And so you're going to split students up into some smaller groups, hopefully of about 3 to 4 students, to travel amongst the seasons. And you're going to set these up kind of in 4 different sections of this circle. And you're going to give them just short amounts of time to go and explore those sections. So in each tub, you'll see maybe some plant specimens or some pictures of tools or pictures of people utilizing those tools or doing some different activities for those different seasons. And these tubs are all representative of the seasonal round of the Shasta and Takelma and Cow Creek Umpqua tribes. So, for example, in fall, you're going to see things like acorns and maybe even some grasshoppers and tarweed, because in the fall it was a time for collecting, harvesting, and burning fields to collect seeds and grasshoppers for that winter time when they would need to have preserved foods. And they're going to have different things in all those different tubs. This is also a great opportunity as an instructor to kind of put your own pieces into those tubs. So these tubs will grow and change with the seasons as you collect items to go in them. And it's also a place where you can really highlight things that you know about and that you have a lot of enthusiasm for. So please feel free to add to these tubs, create them, help them to grow, and eventually they'll have some really great resources for these students to explore. I would give students about 3 to 4 minutes per tub, so not a lot of time. We want to make sure they get around to all of the seasons before coming back together for the evaluate. To wrap up this lesson, we're going to give some time to evaluate and reflect. So in the students' notebooks, they will have a blank seasonal round that they can have an opportunity to fill out for themselves. So not really necessarily thinking about the past or the Shasta and Takelma people, but more about themselves and how they interact with plants and the seasons. So giving students some time to find a quiet space, hand out pencils or colored pencils, and share again the poster of a seasonal round to give them a little bit of inspiration, but to have them really think about what are the things that you do in winter? What are the foods that you eat? What are the things you do in the summer and the foods that you eat? And where do those resources come from? What is your experience with the season and plants? And also encourage them, just like in the seasonal round posters that we've seen, to use symbols and labels to depict their celebrations, events, and foods. So there's lots of different ways that students can create those seasonal rounds. Just give them plenty of time to take those reflective moments. In terms of modifications for this activity, remember that at the end of each lesson, there's a variety of ways you might modify any of our lessons, whether or not it's for social distancing, mobility, English language learners, or for time, whether or not you have extra time or less time. So go back and review those. Specifically for this activity, I think the biggest modification is looking at mobility for the hike. If mobility is something that's going to create a challenge for that first ethnobotany hike, you might consider doing the whole lesson right here in the circle, or maybe even moving it, the main part of the lesson and the plant identification towards the kitchen dining area that's more accessible. You can always front load that hike with examples as opposed to doing the hike in itself. So if you know you're not going to be able to do the hike with your group, maybe you can go out and collect some of those acorns or yarrow leaves or wild strawberries to give examples instead of actually doing the hike. And lastly, I want to just highlight for English language learners, definitely you can utilize the vocabulary and section of the lesson. Go over the vocabulary before you even begin so that students are familiar with these new words like ethnobotany or maybe some of the plant names. And then also encourage students to write in their first language in their notebooks. So especially as they're creating their seasonal round, they can utilize their first language and write in whatever, or draw pictures in whatever way that they would like to. So feel free to encourage that and have fun.